everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today, Olivia, we're going to talk about America's first great private eye and his publishing empire. Now, when I think of 19th century detectives, does anybody come to mind in your mind?
Sherlock Holmes?
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes, right. But this man pre-existed Sherlock Holmes, and he was an American, and he influenced Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, so pretty interesting. And his name was Allan Pinkerton. Have you heard the name Pinkerton?
Yes.
Or Pinkertons? Okay. Do you watch the show The Gilded Age?
Yes, I do.
Well, that maybe is where you heard about the Pinkertons, because they developed quite a reputation as being strikebreakers. And, when you needed to call in people to help with your labor problems, who did the wealthy industrialists call? They called America's first great detective agency, the Pinkertons. And so they make a little cameo there in Gilded Age. But that's really what they're known for today. But Allan Pinkerton was much more than that. He was a Scotsman, and he immigrated to America, and he moved to Chicago before the Civil War. And he was very interesting because he was an early supporter of John Brown. And John Brown started out west, even before Harper's Ferry. Well, Pinkerton helped raise money for Brown. He was very much anti-slavery. And ironically, Olivia, he was very much pro the working man, which seems to clash with the later Pinkertons. But actually, that is really the direction that the agency takes after Allan Pinkerton's death, when it is run by his children. So the early Allan Pinkerton, quite a radical. He also is famous during the Civil War because he helps thwart an assassination plot on Abraham Lincoln. And Pinkerton was friends with McClellan. A couple weeks ago on Buy Day, we did McClellan's battle tactics along with the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Check out that Buy Day if you want. But McClellan convinced Pinkerton he should be the head of the Union's sort of operations for intelligence during the Civil War. And among other things, he stopped a plot in Baltimore to assassinate Abraham Lincoln before his inauguration. But after the Civil War, do you know what he really wants to do and loves to do? It is become a writer. And he goes back to his hometown of Chicago, and he writes novels, detective novels, that are so modern and so interesting that, as I say, they influence the entire genre. They really are precursors to Sherlock Holmes. And we are fortunate because, look, Olivia, came in fresh from Chicago, just unpacked, 2 early Chicago imprints, the first 2 books written by Allan Pinkerton. And let's start with this one. It's called The Expressman and the Detective. And then the second one, which is actually a collection of stories. So you have a novel and a collection of short stories. Also sounds a bit like Sherlock Holmes, right? 2 different formats. Now, first thing you notice, right, is the motto of the Pinkerton Detective Agency: we never sleep. And you also notice that they have these rather disconcerting eyes. What do you think of when you see the eye?
The Illuminati?
Well, maybe, but yeah, I guess so. But, not only is the eye open, implying that they don't sleep, but he is the first person to really coin the phrase private eye, right? So when you hire a personal detective, you hire a private eye, it's reinforced by Pinkerton. Now let's look at this book, because it's a really interesting book. Now these are post-Chicago fire imprints, both of them, but they are both published in Chicago in 1875, and they start, as I say, an empire, which really sort of takes off. A whole series of detective stories that Allan Pinkerton writes. So this is the short story 1. This is the first novel, and they're both 1875 Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire, just a few years earlier than that, wipes out most of the city. But now the city's coming back, publishing is coming back, and Pinkerton is basically claiming, and he will claim this in the introduction and preface to the novels, that these are true stories, and that basically they're based on details and cases that he has worked on during his life. And I think it starts out that way, Olivia. It really does. And that makes them even more credible and more interesting. There's also a phenomenon going on in America in the 1870s. It's called the sort of dime novel. You get all these sort of Western novels and other things with basically, rather dramatic woodcut engravings. And if you look at the illustrations in these books, they sort of look like they're out of those dime novels of the period. Look at this one from the first novel. In a second, Mrs. Maroney grasped a pitcher and smashed it over Josh's skull. well, it's filled with illustrations like that, which I think are really cool. And here's one that could be out of a sort of dime novel, or what you might call a penny dreadful. Hand me the knife, I said firmly, or I will splatter the room with your brains. See, this is something for Victorian America in 1875. Now, these stories are actually really interesting. They're well written and they're based on true stories. But what happens is, if they become so popular, they sell 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 copies. Chicago can't keep up. They move to the publishing center of New York, and look what happens, Olivia. You get a whole series of Pinkerton novels that come out, each now being branded with the I. You see, the original I only appeared on the first book. It didn't actually appear on his second book, but when they made them a sort of uniform edition and they moved the publishing from Chicago to New York, here, let me show you, they really capitalized on that I. And if you look at the front of these books, you'll see that it's just one after another, after another, after another. And here you see that these are all later. So these are 1870s, but these are after Pinkerton's death. And these are when his son is running the firm. And this is when they're getting the reputation as the Union Busters. And look what you're reading about. You're reading about the Molly Maguires. That was a Pennsylvania union busting effort. Olivia, you've been to Jim Thorpe. You're in Chunk, so you know all about it. But you can basically see, maybe from the title of this one, let's get this great title here: Strikers, Communists, Tramps, and Detectives. Right? You gotta avoid all those things, according to the Pinkertons. Now, what makes this collection even more interesting, Olivia, is that these books came in a box with several incredibly radical books from the same period, written by the very people that the Pinkertons were working against. And what I mean by that is, you have an incredible book here by Alexander Berkman called Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist. And this takes place, again, after the original Allan's death, but as the Pinkertons are burnishing their reputation, whether it's with the Molly Maguires, the Homestead strike in the 1880s and 1890s, as strikebreakers, you have Berkman getting sent to jail for being an anarchist. And who sends him to jail? It's the Pinkertons. And in jail, what does he write? He writes his prison memoirs. And it is basically the memoirs of an anarchist who is disgusted with not only the lack of progress in American society, but also the powerful forces like the Pinkertons that are trying to stop progressive social change. Berkman, if you don't know him, he was the lover and co-companion of Emma Goldman. And I really like this book because it also lists the titles in the anarchist library. So if you wanted to be a good anarchist at the time, really the opposite library that you would have of the Pinkerton detective books on your, but your library could have one or the other. You might get the Library of Anarchism, and you could read Emma Goldman's contributions, also by the same publisher. Look at all those titles by Emma Goldman, only 5 or 10 cents a piece. And you could also read things like a novel about the Haymarket riots of 1887 in Chicago. So again, Chicago is the center of this great debate between anarchism and Pinkertonism. But the publishing empire is really still New York at that time. It shifted to New York, so the books are really getting published out of New York City, even though the topics are Chicago. And there's one more interesting one. It came in at the same time. And this book is contemporaneous. It came out literally 1 year before Pinkerton himself died in 1883. And it's a wonderful book by a sort of radical Marxist by the name of Paul Lafargue. You don't know this about Paul Lafargue, but he was Karl Marx's son-in-law. So he married Karl Marx's daughter. And he wrote this great book, which would have infuriated a man like Allan Pinkerton, who believed in working every day, which was called The Right to be Lazy. And it basically is just an ode to not the right to work. He's not in favor of unionization. He's in favor of people not working. Yes, that's right. A strange delusion possesses the working classes of the nations where capitalist civilization holds its sway. This delusion drags in its train the individual and society woes. It goes on, the moralists have cast a sacred halo over work. Blind and finite men, they have wished to be wiser than their God. Weak and contemptible men, basically, we shouldn't have to work. We can be lazy. And And this book was so radical that even Marx wrote Lafargue and said, well, I guess I'm not a Marxist. So you have Marx claiming he's not a Marxist, and you have Lafargue being even more radical than Marx. And so you have basically an anarchist library and a Pinkerton library, both happening here in the 1870s and 1880s in Chicago, and both coming to the Midtown Scholar together as part of somebody's interesting collection. But now you know where the term private eye came from. All right, we're going to end with a funny book. I mentioned how the illustrations in the Pinkertons were sort of out of those sort of dime novels of the 1870s and 1880s. We also have a really funny book which has to do with pulps. You know, we got a lot of pulp books which happened sort of at the turn of the century and into the 19-teens and 20s. And this is a great book, I thought, Olivia, because what this artist has done, and it's got a foreword by Chip Kidd, is the artist has simply taken examples of these pulp mass market books, and he has cut them out, the images on the covers, to make incredible 3D art. So these are literally the covers of the books being cut out so as to make them really, really interesting. And although I'm not in favor of cutting up old books, it is a way to take books and give them sort of a second life as works of art. And aren't they cool? Yeah. I think they're really cool. So at the tent sale this past book festival, and in the future, we have lots and lots of mass market pulps from the early 20th century in America. And wouldn't it be neat to turn some of them into great works of art? So Uncovered, pretty cool, funny book for the week. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday and every Friday at noon going forward for more adventures in the world of books.